I would now like to welcome Mr. Felix Larkin, here tonight to present his lecture on legal cartoons. Felix is a former academic director of the Carlow Summer School and is a co-founder and former chairman of the newspaper and periodical History Forum of Ireland. He has written extensively on the press in Ireland in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and has had a particular interest in historical cartoons. His publications include Terror and Discord, the Seamus cartoons in the Freeman's Journal, 1920 to 1924, which was published in 2009. Having studied history at University College Dublin, he was an Irish public servant for 36 years before reverting to the role of non-stipendary historian in his retirement. So I will now hand you over to Felix.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and it's very nice to be back in Carlow. This is actually my third visit. I was previously here in 2012 and 2015, so it's taken you a long time to invite me back, but anyhow, let's see. Yeah. Satire, whether in literary form or in cartoons, is generally regarded as something that punches up. In other words, a weapon of the powerless against dominant groups and people. Accordingly, lawyers and the law are obvious targets. The arcane and archaic rituals of the law invite ridicule, and so too does the showy and sometimes bombastic style of many of its successful practitioners. Moreover, the fact that the law often has what seems, at least to the outsider, perverse outcomes, makes it fair game for satire, laughter being a way of bridging the gap between common sense and the peculiar logic of the law. It is the perverse outcomes of the law that give rise to the expression, "the law is an ass," coined by Charles Dickens, when in Oliver Twist, a particular aspect of law is explained to Mr. Bumble, he responds as follows: "If the law supposes that, the law is an ass, an idiot." This cartoon illustrates the point vividly. A donkey dressed as a judge, administering law by the classes for the masses. It was published in 1912 in the Irish Worker, the organ of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, the union of Jim Larkin. And it is by Ernest Kavanagh, an insurance clerk employed by the ITGWU, who moonlighted as a cartoonist. Tragically, he was shot dead on the front steps of Liberty Hall by a military sniper on Easter Tuesday, 1916. What he was doing there is unclear. He may simply have been attempting naively to go into work. The title of the cartoon is The Asinine Law, with two S's, just to ram home the message. My purpose in this lecture is to examine how the law and lawyers have been depicted in a selection of Irish cartoons over more than 2 centuries. I am not concerned with the legal constraints within which Irish cartoonists have pursued their quirky craft, other than to note that there are such constraints. Most obviously, the law of libel. Thus, for example, this cartoon by Martin Turner of the Irish Times on the occasion of Charles Haughey's resignation as Taoiseach in 1992. It was not published at that time because it was considered libelous by the newspaper's lawyers. Its theme was Haughey's accumulation of wealth during his years in public office. One of the very first satirical cartoons published in Ireland likewise fell afoul of the law, and the result was the imprisonment of the editor of the newspaper in which it appeared, the Volunteers' Journal. The editor was Matthew Carey, and he published the offending cartoon on the 5th of April, 1784. Entitled, "Thus Perish All Traitors to Their Country," the target of the cartoon was John Foster, Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Irish Parliament at College Green, which is seen in the background. John Fitzgerald, in a recent column in the Irish Times, described Foster as Ireland's first modern Minister for Finance. Matthew Carey was arraigned for contempt before the Irish House of Commons on account of this cartoon, and held for a time in Newgate Prison in Dublin. On his release, but with a prosecution still pending against him, he fled to America and had a highly successful career as a publisher in Philadelphia. Among the most prominent lawyers in Ireland in the 1780s and for some time afterwards was John Philpot Curran, whose daughter Sarah was the inamorata of Robert Emmet. He served as Irish Master of the Rolls from 1806 to 1814. And in that capacity, though reimagined as the Master of the Scrolls, he was caricatured in this cartoon. Note the scrolls in his pouch include petitions, affidavits, briefs, etc. Daniel O'Connell, seen here in silhouette, is acknowledged as the greatest Irish lawyer of the early 19th century, and perhaps the greatest in Irish history. He was the subject of many cartoons. This one is, I think, special because of the very rich illustrations in its borders. It was published in Punch in 1845, and the title is The O'Connell Rent, referring to the subscriptions raised from the public for O'Connell's Repeal Association. The main image shows abject and deferential peasants paying the so-called rent to the great man. It's a pretty crude caricature, unlike the wonderfully whimsical drawings of incidents in O'Connell's life that appear in the borders. The upper border shows the military presence at Clontarf to prevent the monster meeting there, which O'Connell cancelled at the last moment in 1843. And that is juxtaposed against a police assault on gingerbread stalls, presumably hawkers plying for business on the margins of the monster meeting. The lower border focuses on the trial of O'Connell and others in 1844 for conspiracy against the state. O'Connell is in the dock. Just to show you where he is, he's over there. Sorry, this isn't really working on the screen, I'm sorry. O'Connell is in the dock. The presiding judges are opposite him, and in between there is an incident involving dueling pistols, a not too subtle allusion to the duel in 1815 between O'Connell and John de Stair, in which de Stair was killed. At either end, the Prime Minister, Robert Peel, and the Duke of Wellington, a leading member of Peel's government, keep an eye on what is going on. And O'Connell appears in this delightful print of a Petty Sessions Court in Ballyragget, County Kilkenny, dated circa 1867. Petty Sessions were relatively informal affairs, presided over by a Justice of the Peace, who often had no legal training. What we have here is a case of assault. The plaintiff's head is bandaged, and he is pointing out his assailant. A bust of Daniel O'Connell sits on the shelf high up on the wall, overseeing the proceedings, testifying to the esteem in which his memory is held. This is another court scene. A cartoon from the Weekly Freeman in July 1881, showing the prosecution of some Land League ladies. The Ladies' Land League is an important but neglected part of the story of the Land War in the early 1880s. They kept the Land War going when Parnell and the other Land League leaders were imprisoned in 1881. It is a scene from Kilmallock Petty Sessions, and the presiding resident magistrate was a Major Clifford Lloyd, hence the title of the cartoon, Justice Unalloyed. Gladstone's Land Act of 1881 was an attempt to address some of the concerns of the Land League. It gave power to civil bill courts to fix rents, termed judicial rents, with provision for referral to a land commission to appeal the judicial rents. This act was seen as creating endless possibilities for legal wrangling, a cash cow for lawyers. Accordingly, the satirical magazine Pat, in January 1882, looked into the future with this vision of Ireland 100 years later, with the lawyers so rich that they have displaced the old landlords as the proprietors of the land and are now sitting comfortably on their rents. The Atlantic Ocean has become the Atlantic Ocean, the St. George's Channel, the Gorge on Us Channel, and Ireland is Direland. The same idea is suggested here, also from the magazine Pat, but in 1881, before the Land Bill became law. In the dispute between two cats, the landlord and the tenant, it is the legal monkey who devours the spoils. This, of course, echoes Charles Dickens' indictment of the legal system in his 1850s novel, Bleak House. My next set of images relates to the special commission established in 1888 to inquire into the charges made by the London Times newspaper against Parnell in a series of articles entitled Parnellism and Crime. Here's how the United Ireland newspaper portrays Parnell's cross-examination at the commission. Parnell is, and I quote, a contemptuous giant, while his interrogator, wielding a sword marked cross-examination, is a bumptious pygmy. The cartoonist here is John D. Ray, principal cartoonist of the United Ireland newspaper. Ultimately, when the Special Commission issued its report, which largely exonerated Parnell and his followers, it was the Times that found itself metaphorically in the dock, as in this cartoon from the Weekly Freeman, dated the 22nd of February, 1890. The sentence being handed down by the judges, and again I quote, is that you shall be held in odium and contempt for the rest of your natural life. The Weekly Freeman cartoons at this time were drawn by John Fergus O'Hay, described by the late Perry Curtis, my great mentor in cartoon studies, as among the finest political cartoonists of the Victorian era. Richard Piggott, the forger of the letters presented as evidence to support the accusations made against Parnell by the Times, was the subject of a wonderful Vanity Fair cartoon by Spy, Sir Leslie Ward, the greatest and most prolific of the Vanity Fair cartoonists. Two of the leaders of the Irish Party at Westminster after Parnell, John Redmond and Tim Healy, were lawyers and were also the subject of Spy cartoons. Redmond twice, in 1892 and 1904. What we have here is the earlier one. This cartoon appeared in The Leprechaun, a humorous monthly magazine published between 1905 and 1915. It dates from 1906 and echoes the cartoon we saw earlier, in which the legal monkey devours everything that is in dispute. Another Leprechaun cartoon from the same year, 1906, makes the same point, targeting solicitors specifically. I like the name of the firm, Chisholm, Bilcom and Buncombe. These two cartoons were drawn by Thomas Fitzpatrick, who was a protege of John Fergus O'Hay and grandfather of the well-known Irish artist, Jim Fitzpatrick. You will all recognise the distinctive figure of Sir Edward Carson in this brilliant cartoon by Laborio Prosperi, one of a number of Italian artists who worked for Vanity Fair. Carson's elongated figure and doleful countenance made him an ideal subject for a caricaturist. And there are many cartoons of him that I could show you if I had more time this evening. The one that I have chosen is by Seamus, the pseudonym of Ernest Forbes, the cartoonist in Dublin's Freeman's Journal newspaper from 1920 to 1924. The Freeman was a moderate nationalist paper, formerly the organ of the Irish Parliamentary Party. And so Carson, the leader of the Northern Unionists, was a regular butt of its cartoons. This one, from November 1920, is entitled The Carson Kids. Lloyd George and Sir Hamer Greenwood, the Chief Secretary for Ireland, are portrayed as children clutching Carson's apron strings. The implication is that with Lloyd George dependent on the support of the Conservative Party to continue in office, Carson can dictate the government's policy in Ireland. The concept of justice is very much under scrutiny in my next cartoon, taken from Dublin Opinion magazine in March 1938. The underlying concern here is whether justice is well served when lawyers huddle together and work out some deal. The implication is that it is not. This was quite a daring cartoon for Dublin Opinion, Ireland's self-styled national humorous journal, published between 1922 and 1968. Generally speaking, the editors of Dublin Opinion confined themselves to politics and social life. Some areas, such as religion and the law, were out of bounds, not fair game for satire. Why this reticence at that time about the law? I would guess it was because of the danger of being held in contempt of court. As Judge Mary Kotsanouris wrote in an article on criticising judges in Ireland, contempt of court issues were particularly sensitive in the early days of the newly independent state. Given the distrust of the legal system under the old regime, it was all the more important that the administration of justice in the new dispensation should be accorded obedience and respect. The courts insisted on that, and this must have influenced press coverage, including cartoons. While Dublin Opinion may have refrained from mocking judges and the law, it felt free to comment on constitutional questions. Thus, when De Valera unveiled his draft new constitution in 1937, Dublin Opinion reflected the widespread criticism of the position of women that it posited. The emphasis on a woman's life within the home. A cover cartoon depicted De Valera asleep in bed and dreaming of being attacked by the iconic figures of Queen Maeve and Grania Whale, carrying a spear and a sword, respectively. The caption reads, "Hey, big boy," about those articles in the new constitution. Dublin Opinion's cover cartoons were always fantastic. Take a look at this one from February 1962. Charles Haughey had recently been appointed Minister for Justice and was embarking on a long overdue programme of reform of the legal system. These were the days when even the Irish Times could regard Haughey without irony as the golden boy of Irish politics. There is a great distance reputationally, all of it downhill, from that cartoon to the one by Martin Turner on the occasion of Haughey's resignation as Taoiseach. I have a few more Martin Turner cartoons to show you. Here is his verdict on Mr. Justice Hamilton's Beef Tribunal report, pithy and to the point. For the Flood Tribunal on abuses in the planning system, he adopts a biblical motif, capitalizing on the name of Mr. Justice Flood and invoking Noah's Ark with a multiplicity of lawyers entering 2 by 2. And this is how he celebrates the bonanza for lawyers, represented by the tribunals investigating Haughey's financial affairs and related matters. The lawyer echoes Haughey's alleged words of thanks to Ben Dunn for the money he gave him. But instead of big fella, the lawyer says little fella. I began by quoting Dickens that the law is an ass. Martin Turner's variation on this idea is that the law is a pass machine, with the taxpayer increasingly having to meet legal costs, and not only in relation to tribunals. Turner was employed by the Irish Times as its first full-time cartoonist in the mid-1970s. And I think we could all agree with Professor Ternance-Brown's assessment that, and I quote, his politically astute cartoons add to the newspaper's reputation for sharply expressed and hard-hitting commentary. This is particularly true of his contributions on what might be called the liberal agenda. The greatest example of his work in this vein is the cartoon published on the front page of the Irish Times on the 17th of February 1992 in response to the state's efforts to prevent a pregnant 14-year-old girl known as Miss X travelling to England for an abortion. It linked the young girl's predicament with internment as in Northern Ireland in the 1970s. The depiction of her with her hair in a pigtail and carrying a teddy bear, standing on a map of the state with a razor-topped fence surrounding its borders, speaks volumes. A more recent cartoon on the subject of abortion is this one, published by the Irish Examiner in response to the US Supreme Court's action in overturning Roe v. Wade, the decision that had established a constitutional right to abortion in the United States. It echoes the famous painting American Gothic and is by Harry Burton, a promising young Irish cartoonist. Here's another Harry Burton cartoon from September 2025, celebrating the dismissal of the case brought in the UK against the kneecap rapper Liam O'Haney, otherwise known as Machara, for allegedly showing support for a prescribed terrorist organisation. That is, I think, a suitable point at which to end. My lecture has taken a somewhat jaundiced view of the law and lawyers. I make no apology for that. As the distinguished jurist Lord Bingham of Cornhill wrote, respect for the rule of law does not require us to swoon in adulation of the law, let alone lawyers. He elaborates as follows. Belief in the rule of law does not import unqualified admiration of the law, or the legal profession, or the courts, or the judges. We can hang on to most of our prejudices about the law and lawyers. It does, however, call on us to accept that we would very much rather live in a country which complies, or at least seeks to comply, with the rule of law, than in one that does not. The hallmark of a regime that flouts the rule of law are, alas, all too familiar. The midnight knock on the door, the sudden disappearance, the show trial, the subjection of prisoners to genetic experiment, the confession extracted by torture, the gulag and the concentration camp, the gas chamber, the practice of genocide or ethnic cleansing, the waging of aggressive war. The list is endless. Better, Lord Bingham says, to put up with some choleric judges and greedy lawyers. I agree, but it is great fun to lampoon such judges and lawyers, and also the multifarious and nefarious practices of the legal world. Let us rejoice that we are free to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Felix. That was absolutely wonderful. Really enjoyed that. I'm sure there's loads of questions for you. You're happy to answer.
Yeah, happy. Yeah.
Referring to the slide that you showed of the trial of the London Times,
Yeah.
the three people in the judges' box.
Let's see now.
Number 20.
Yeah.
Are the three people in the judges' boxes and the two in front of them, are they identifiable, or are they?
That's a good question, Jim. That looks suspiciously like Parnell there, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It is, of course, fictional because the Times wasn't actually tried as such. The answer is I don't know. I'm afraid. Yes. Well, I have written about. I have written about the Seamus cartoons in the Freeman's Journal. There's a book, as Helen said in the introduction. published in 2009 by Tony Farmer, who's sadly now deceased, but it was a very small but very nice publisher, very niche publisher. I've also written an essay, a long essay, on Dublin Opinion magazine, which is in a volume that Mark O'Brien and DCU and myself have co-edited. That was published, I think, 2014. And I've just published, having co-edited with Niamh Howlin in UCD, a volume of essays for the Irish Legal History Society called Confluences in Law and History. And there's a very full essay by me on legal cartoons. Obviously, the lecture this evening is culled from that. There are a couple of extra cartoons in the lecture this evening, and I've left some out. Like obviously, the kneecap cartoon is completely up to date, so it didn't get into the legal history volume. But yeah, I have lots and lots and lots of cartoons. The Irish Times did they commissioned from me a general overview of Irish cartoons some years ago, and published it very nicely in a very yeah. The problem, there are two problems. One, because of the number of illustrations, there's an enormous amount of work in assembling them and getting versions of them that are publishable. The first time I spoke about legal cartoons was as far back as 2015. And when I came to publish the essay in the Confluences volume for the Legal History Society, I innocently, naively, made my PowerPoint images available to Four Courts Press for publication, and they rejected every single one of them as not of sufficient quality for our publication. Now, they do lovely books, and they have very high standard. But the result was that I found myself in the summer of 2024, spending most of the summer trying to track down cartoons, which for the most part I had identified as far back as 2015. I couldn't remember where I found them. And then having to pay for the reproduction and rights to get high quality images of them. So there is a huge amount of work involved in putting together a book like that. So the answer is yes. If a publisher were to come along and offer me something, I'd be tempted, but maybe not immediately. I think the legal history cartoon kind of broke me for the moment. But yeah, I love the subject of cartoons, and I think they are very useful as a historical source because they give you a window into what people were thinking at the time. Like we inevitably we look at the past with hindsight, with the benefit of hindsight. Newspapers generally are a good source for what are people thinking about this at the time, and cartoons, of course, are very sharp and to the point. And Steve Bell, the cartoonist in The Guardian, he has a phrase which I've used on occasion, that you can say things in a cartoon that you can say in print or in prose, if you like. It's a sharper message, and you can see that in some of the cartoons I showed you today. Yeah.
That cartoons have played a big role in change. Have they
yeah. Though the all media historians, not only historians of cartoons, but of newspapers generally, we all agonize over the question of what is the influence of the press? Does it have any influence? And there are two schools of thought. One is that it does shape public opinion. The other extreme is that it reflects public opinion. The truth of the matter is it probably does a little bit of both. But there was an American journalist called Walter Lippmann in the early 20th century. And Lippmann wrote, I think it was in about 1912, he wrote the first treatise on the press, if you like, looking at the press as a phenomenon. And his verdict was that the power of the press is the power to signalize. So the press has an ability to ignore a story or to run with it. His argument is, and I think he hits the nail on the head, it does not necessarily tell you what to think, but it does tell you what to think about. And I think that's the key, and that's true of cartoons too. It's another weapon in the armory of a newspaper. They write their editorials, they have letters to the editors, they have their reportage, which is supposed to be neutral but never is. You also have cartoons as another piece of the armory. Ian, yeah.
It strikes me an interesting thing. In the age in which we live, which is truly in many ways a surreal age, the age of Trump, can cartoonists out-Trump Trump himself? And are they in danger of, in fact, running out of a market, I'd say, because the world around them is so absurd? Can a cartoonist make it any more absurd and get us thinking?
Well, actually, Ian, I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is that Trump and politicians of his ilk, on the one hand, and the woke culture on the other hand, is making it very difficult to send up anybody or anything. So there is no longer a receptivity for poking fun at our sacred cows. We are supposed to bow down in front of them, whether it be as Trump on one hand, or one of the woke causes like transgenderism or whatever. In the States, an enormous number of newspapers have ceased political cartoons. As far back as 2019, the New York Times ceased having an editorial cartoon. It had been criticized for a cartoon that was regarded as anti-Semitic, probably wrongly, but anyhow. Since Trump has come back, most newspapers have ceased their cartoons. And there was a case in early 2025, wonderful cartoonist called Al Taldays in the Washington Post. And for whatever reason, there are very few women cartoonists anywhere. But she's a brilliant draftsperson, apart from any other consideration. Wonderfully subtle cartoons. And she, just before Trump's inauguration, which had been funded by the tech titans, she did a cartoon with 4 or 5 of them, including Mickey Mouse representing Disney, bowing down in front of a statue of Trump. And one of the people she depicted clearly in the cartoon was Jeff Bezos, who now owns the Washington Post. And her editor wouldn't publish it. And she resigned and has not been replaced. Equally, in Britain, Steve Bell, whom I mentioned earlier, who was as rough as they come. He was a really, really hard-hitting cartoonist. He was let go by the Guardian, the great liberal paper. So yes, I think cartoon. It's not a question of has the world become so mad that you can send it up. It actually it now has become cartoonists have become an endangered species, and you obviously go back to Charlie Hebdo in 2015. But that was the beginning of a sense that there were things you could not talk about. Like Martin Turner is not a young man. He's even older than I am, God knows. When Martin Turner hangs up his pen, will he be replaced? Now, Harry Burton, who I'm a big fan of, Harry Burton is a young fellow of, I'd say, 40-ish. He contributes to the Irish Examiner and occasionally to the Sunday Independent. Will he get 20 or 30 years out of it as Martin Turner did in the Irish Times? I wonder. It's grim.
Is there a replacement for, say, cartoons? If there's a gap created by the, what will slip in there?
But that's a very interesting question, actually, because in the early days of the state in the 1920s, Dublin Opinion started in 1922, just before the start of the Civil War, which was a very, very daring thing for two young fellas to, and like I've spoken about Dublin Opinion here before, but they started in March 1922, which is 3 months before the bombardment of the forecourts, and they kept it going until 1968. There were no cartoons, apart from some cartoons in the very early days of the Irish press, by a man called Victor Brown. There were no cartoons in Irish daily newspapers right up to the demise of Dublin Opinion. That it was as if Dublin Opinion had kind of sucked all the potential for cartoons, and then there was nothing. Victor Brown in the early, I'll say in the point. The Irish Times began an occasional cartoon after that, done by Nick Robinson, Mary Robinson's husband, but he was never employed as a cartoonist. He was a freelancer. And then Martin Turner, who at that stage was the editor of the Fortnight magazine in Belfast, and used to illustrate the covers of Fortnight. He then started to do occasional cartoons for the Irish Times. And in 1976, they employed him as their full-time cartoonist. So you could say that between the demise of Dublin Opinion and the recruitment of Martin Turner, there was no steady or cartoon presence. You'd had the occasional appearance. So for example, I was mentioned Victor Brown in the Irish press. When De Valera started the Irish press in 1931, he was very influenced by the American newspaper model. And the Irish press, for example, was the first paper that had news on the front page. The Independent and the Times all had small ads or whatever. And he had Victor Brown as a cartoonist, and some of Victor Brown's cartoons are absolutely superb. They're very, very, very tough. There's a guy in Belfast called Barry Shepherd who's done some serious work on Brown. De Valera comes into power in 1932. By 1933, Brown is gone because De Valera does not want a cartoonist taking a pot shot at government once he's in government. Brown was there as a weapon against the Cumann na nGaedheal government. Yes, I do.
It's a wonderful presentation, Felix, and I'd say it's part of the audience's appetite for looking at more cartoons and their own choices and such. Would you recommend any online sites for them to go look at?
Yeah, well,
obviously your own publications as well.
But my own publications are there. There's a great book by Four Courts Press called Confluences, Law and History, and they've really the Legal History Society paid for it rather than Four Courts Press, but they indulged me with pages and pages and pages of colour reproductions, which is an expensive thing to do, as you know very well. So that was great. The Irish Times puts Martin Turner's cartoon up on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, every day. Martin Turner himself used to do it, but he has withdrawn from X. You can get Harry Burton's cartoons also on X. He does maybe one a week. He's not every day. I'm a big fan of Peter Brooks in the London Times, and again, he's available on X. I generally follow my cartoons on X. There's a London. I have to think of the name of the guy now in a minute. It'll come to me. But there's a guy who runs a shop in London called. Is it the Cartoon Museum? But he again has a Twitter account or an X account, and every year he brings out the best cartoons. These would be British cartoons, the best cartoons of the year. So I've got a great collection of those. Martin Turner has published several volumes of his cartoons. Sometimes a random selection, other times quite a focused one. He has a great volume on Irish Tishy, and his like Martin Turner's image of Bertie Ahern with his yellow trousers is just classic. Like nobody can think of a Bertie without thinking of the yellow trousers. And he was picking that up actually from Steve Bell, who took a series of prime ministers and put them in ridiculous situations. Off the top of my head, the one I remember was David Cameron, who'd be always portrayed with a condom over his head. Because he was such a smooth, but he had the condom with a little bubble at the top. There are lots of places where you can find cartoons. Yeah. Well, there's British archive, British Cartoon Archive in the University of Kent. Let me tell you a funny story about. It's relatively easy to get reproductions of cartoons in Ireland. It's relatively cheap. For the Legal History Society book, I must have used about 10, 12 cartoons from the National Library's collection. And in total, it cost me something like about 120 euros. I wanted, and I haven't, it is relevant to legal cartoons, so it isn't in this. I wanted to use a David Lowe cartoon about the Treaty of 1922, brilliant cartoon. And I went hunting for that. I had the image, but I didn't have permission to use it. It appeared the cartoon I wanted to use was obviously from 1922. It was in an evening paper called the Evening Star, which no longer exists, but is now part of the Murdoch. It has been merged into at various stages, and it ends up to today. The copyright is with Murdoch. I discovered that he has a London company to look after his copyright. So I had to write to them and get permission to use the David Lowe cartoon and pay something like £100 sterling for the permission to use the cartoon. Having sorted that, they then informed me, well, we don't actually have the cartoon. The cartoon is in the Cartoon Archive in Kent. So I had to write to them and pay another 50 euros in order to get them to send me the image in a high-res image. And the first question they asked when, of course, I ordered the cartoon from them is, do you have permission from the paper to use the cartoon? So and there's also there was a for the Legal History Society book. I like at least with on a murder, you're dealing with a commercial shark, but there was a wonderful Art Deco style image of Carson, which featured in a cigarette cart of all things in the early 1920s. And I've used that in the legal history volume. And it's part of a collection of cigarette cards, all by the same artist and all in the same style, of major political figures in Britain in the 1920s, which is held by the National Portrait Gallery, which is in the public service. So I applied to them for permission to use the cartoon, and they charged me €120. A public body. I was outraged. I had to have the cartoon because I think it's probably my own favourite image of all the ones that I used in the legal history. But yeah, there are plenty of places to go hunting cartoons. Most of the American cartoons who have been discontinued are on a thing called Substack. I'm not quite sure how it works. I don't pay for it. I think I probably should because you know these people are trying to make some sort of a living having been discontinued, their employment having been discontinued. But anyhow.
Just one comment. Speaking of cartoonists, the most improbable one that I came across was one for a little magazine called Focus, an Irish magazine that existed between 1958 and 1966. And it was a very small outfit. And their cartoonist was a man called David Rowe. He was their financial accountant.
There was a wonderful exhibition in the Lindenhall Library in Belfast, or it must be 10 years ago now, of cartoons of the Troubles, both in Northern Irish papers and in British papers. And I wrote a review of it for. There was a blog, a history blog called Writing the Troubles. I don't know whether either you ever came across that. It was run out of Edinburgh University, and I did a piece on. It's still available online if you Google it. I don't think that the blog is active, but it's there. The material is there. But there's a wonderful cartoon. Again, I mentioned that there are very few women cartoonists, but there's one very, very able British woman cartoonist called Nicola Jennings, and she has what I think is probably my own personal favourite cartoon of all times. And it's done at the time of the Troubles, and she takes the Irish harp. It was sitting in the middle of her cartoons, and instead of the strings of the harp, she has guns. And there's a shadow of a figure, which I think probably it would be probably lost in a British audience, but not in an Irish one. It's the shadow of the gunman. It's a brilliant cartoon. I've used it, and again, she was. I used it in the Writing the Troubles blog, and they insisted that I get her permission to reproduce it. I just had photographed it from the exhibition in the Lindenhall Library, but she was most accommodating and didn't charge me anything. Like most people are actually decent. It's when you're dealing with the corporations and they're greedy.
Sorry, sir, how was complicated?
There's a magazine called McGill, and they probably had the odd cartoon in the same way as the Felix has the odd cartoon, and Hibernia beforehand had cartoons. And I have been criticised in the past for not including covers from the Phoenix, but I don't really think they're of a great quality, to be perfectly honest with you. And they're not, strictly speaking, cartoons. They're a bit like the cover of Private Eye. They're on a photograph with a funny bubble coming out of somebody's head. I don't think they count. I don't like the politics of the Phoenix anyhow, so. They know. Yeah.
In Dublin Opinion on one occasion, way back in the day, what you're probably familiar with, the cartoon of a Cayley in the
Kildare Street, yes, wonderful cartoon.
It all sticks in my head.
Ian and Ida did a book on Protestant and Irish, and I did an essay for the volume on the depiction of Protestants in Irish cartoons, and I used that one, of course. It's absolute. It's a brilliant. Charles E. Kelly was a fantastic cartoonist. He was the main cartoonist. He would have been the artist of the Haughey cartoon that I showed you. He was really exceptionally good, and of course he was the father of Frank Kelly, of the actor. And again, talking about getting approval for the use of cartoons, I remember contacting him when I started working on Dublin Opinion quite a long time ago. And he said to me, he said, you can use any cartoon that you want as long as you're not making money out of it. If it said it's for an academic publication, that's fine. But he said, every time you use it, I want you to write to me and tell me that you've used it for such and such a magazine or such and such an article. And that I did for as long as he lived. I don't know where I haven't gone chasing who has the copyright at this stage, but he had the copyright in his father's. And the extraordinary thing about C.E. Kelly was, although he was taking potshots at politicians and Irish society, he was a senior civil servant. At one stage, he was the controller of Radio Éireann within the Department of Post and Telegraphs. And so I don't think that would be, as a former civil servant, let me tell you, I don't think that would be tolerated today. But in those days, he got away with it. But yeah, Dublin Opinion was great. I've exhausted them.
We've exhausted.